Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Hey, tonight we're not just telling a story, we're stepping into one. But forget the Hollywood fantasies. This isn't about clean-shaven cowboys riding into town with noble intentions and choreographed duels under the desert sun. No, tonight we're peeling back the dusty curtain on the real Wild West. Raw, brutal, and unforgiving. A place where survival wasn't earned by bravado, but by relentless endurance and quiet suffering. If these glimpses into history speak to something in you, consider giving this a like or even subscribing. It helps this journey reach more people who crave truth over glamour. And I'm always curious, where are you listening from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing our little global campfire grow brighter with each story shared. Now dim the lights. Let the hum of a nearby fan or the quiet of your room pull you inward. Breathe, and come with me into a world that tested the human spirit like few others. You've just opened your eyes to the American frontier in the 1870s. Congratulations? Maybe. You're now part of a legendary chapter of human history. But here's the hard truth. You might not survive the day. The first assault comes not from a bullet or a brawl, but from the air itself, the stench. Not the wild, earthy smell of open plains or pine trees, but something far more jarring. The foul mix of unwashed bodies, manure baking in the sun, and the sour tang of sewage lingering somewhere nearby. It's inescapable. Bathing, if you can call it that, was often a monthly indulgence, more ritual than routine. In winter, people sometimes went the entire season without touching water. Water was life out here, and cleaning your body came last. After the livestock, after the cooking, after the crops. As you sit up on your so-called bed, a sack stuffed with straw and likely home to a small army of bedbugs, you feel it. Pain. Deep, grinding, worn-in pain. Your joints, your back, even your hands ache before you've lifted a finger today. This was everyday life on the frontier. There was no such thing as rest, no days off, no weekend reprieve. Your body was your only tool, and it was used hard until it failed you. You might think your modern job is exhausting. But imagine 14 hours of plowing dry soil under a scorching sun, or carrying water bucket by bucket from a creek miles away, or swinging an axe until your arms go numb, or choking on coal dust hundreds of feet underground in a mine where collapse was just a heartbeat away. And all of this for what? Maybe, just maybe, to live into your mid-30s. If disease, injury, or despair didn't take you first. This was the Wild West. Not a playground of legends, but a proving ground for the soul. And tonight you're walking straight into it. You stand barefoot on the splintered, dusty floor, and the cold bites through your bones like a silent predator. The air inside your cabin is bitter, unmoving. If it's winter, it might be 20 degrees below freezing, and that's inside. Last night, you let the fireplace die down to preserve your dwindling stack of wood. There's no central heating, no thick thermal layers to rescue you. Just a threadbare blanket, stiff fingers, and the echo of your own breath hanging in the air. In summer, the punishment shifts. Heat suffocates. Sweat clings to you like a second skin, soaking every layer you wear, and you're wearing many. Comfort wasn't part of the Wild West equation. Men had maybe 2 outfits to their name, stiff with salt and sweat, canvas or denim pants, coarse cotton shirts that scraped against sunburned skin. Women, they carried the burden of modesty, no matter the temperature. Corsets laced tight around ribs, petticoats that trapped the heat, long dresses dragging through dirt and dust. The fabrics were scratchy, heavy, and often filthy. Laundry was a luxury of time and water no one had. Those romantic images of spotless cowboys and elegant saloon ladies, illusions born decades later in Hollywood. The truth hung heavy, sweat-soaked, and raw. Your stomach twists in a familiar protest. It's morning. Time for breakfast, though it won't bring much relief. Beans, biscuits, coffee if you're lucky. And that's breakfast, lunch, and dinner most days. Fresh produce is a rare miracle. A peach in spring might feel like divine intervention. Meat, when you have it, is salted, smoked, anything to make it last. But nutrition? A concept not yet named. Scurvy was a cruel teacher. Gums bleeding, teeth loosening, proof that even survival came with a cost. You hold out hope for the coffee at least. Cowboys always seem to sip it in the movies like it's nectar of the gods, but what you get is something else entirely. Burnt, bitter, boiled into oblivion. Crushed eggshells or a pinch of salt might tame it, but it barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. Still, you drink it. You need to. The day is waiting, and it doesn't care how tired you are. Before stepping outside, you remember to check your boots, one of those rituals you never skip. Scorpions, snakes, creatures of the night seeking warmth where your feet now go. One careless moment could leave you poisoned, paralyzed, or worse, with no doctor for miles and nothing but pain for company. Then the door creaks open, and you step outside into the vastness of it all. The frontier stretches around you like an endless sigh. Beautiful, yes, but brutal. It humbles you, reminds you that out here you're small, exposed, vulnerable. The sky above might seem calm, but you've learned not to trust it. Storms don't give warning. Blizzards swallow whole families. Tornadoes rip lives, flash floods, wildfires, unrelenting drought. Each one a reminder that nature doesn't care if you've made plans. Even in town, where buildings huddle together like survivors against the wilderness, you're not truly safe. Civilization brings its own afflictions. Disease flows faster than water. There's no sanitation system, no understanding of germs, just the sick and the dying and the fear that you might be next. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, names that whisper through the streets like death's roll call. You take a breath. The air is sharp, heavy with dust and the weight of everything you now know. And yet, you keep moving, because out here you don't get to pause. Survival isn't a goal, it's a rhythm, a fight, a prayer whispered each morning. And sometimes, just sometimes, that prayer is answered. Let's imagine you've decided to visit a town today, one of the many scattered across the American frontier. As you approach, the first thing you notice is how strangely chaotic it feels. There's no grid, no logic to the placement of buildings, just a scattered collection of wooden structures thrown together wherever space allowed. These aren't towns built with a vision. They're desperate attempts at civilization rising out of dust and need. The roads? They aren't roads at all, just dirt tracks beaten down by wagon wheels and hoof prints. When it rains, they become muddy traps that swallow boots and wheels alike. When it's dry, the wind picks up the dust and hurls it into your eyes, your mouth, your clothes. You don't just see the land, you wear it. And then the smell hits you. Overwhelming, sour, unmistakably alive. Horse manure coats the streets, festering in the heat because horses are everywhere and sanitation is nowhere. There are no garbage collectors, no drains, no one whose job it is to keep this place clean. In some parts of town, the waste piles knee-high. Flies dance in thick swarms around your face, crawling on your skin, your food. In moments like this, the spread of disease feels not only understandable, but inevitable. You continue down the main street, swatting at flies, and come across the saloon, the beating, volatile heart of the town. Forget the movies. There are no swinging doors, no golden glow spilling onto polished floors, no charming pianist coaxing melodies from an upright piano. Just a crude, dimly lit room with a rough-hewn plank bar and battered furniture. The air inside is thick with tobacco smoke and something sharper, alcohol cut with pepper, turpentine, tobacco spit, or worse. One drink might numb your nerves, another could blind you. But it's not just the liquor that makes the saloon dangerous. It's the people inside. Men filled with bitterness, loneliness, and too much whiskey. Here, tempers ignite like dry brush. A careless word, a wrong glance, and suddenly guns are drawn. The violence isn't noble or cinematic, it's impulsive, brutal, and pointless. Death comes fast, often to the wrong person, often for no reason at all. You might be startled to see how casually everyone carries a weapon. Guns aren't just for protection from other people. They're tools of survival in a land where wild animals, venomous snakes, and unforgiving landscapes can end a life without warning. But still, the ever-present weight of steel on every hip adds a tension to daily life, a sense that violence is never far from the surface. And ironically, many of these lawless-looking towns had strict gun laws. In places like Dodge City and Tombstone, visitors were required to surrender their weapons at the edge of town. That legendary gunfight at the OK Corral? It started not because someone was itching for glory, but because a group of men refused to obey those very laws. There was no honor in the shootout, just fear, defiance, and blood in the dust. As you walk past the saloon, still haunted by the tension in the air, you pass the local doctor's office, or what passes for one. A small wooden shack, a faded sign swinging in the wind. Inside, you'd find not relief, but a different kind of dread. Most doctors had little formal training. Surgeries were performed with whiskey, hope, and trembling hands. The smell of blood and old antiseptic hangs heavy in the air. One mistake, one infection, and death could come swiftly. Or worse, it could linger. You begin to realize this town, this entire frontier world, wasn't built for comfort. It was built by those who had nowhere else to go, by people chasing hope into the unknown and learning, brutally, that survival out here meant enduring more than you ever imagined. Surgical procedures in the frontier weren't just painful, they were terrifying. Without true anesthesia, whiskey or a dose of morphine was all you had to dull the agony. And without any real understanding of sterilization, a simple procedure could become a death sentence. A small infected cut, something so trivial today, could easily spiral into a full-blown amputation, or worse, a slow and excruciating death. The so-called treatments were often worse than the ailments they were meant to cure. Bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, poisons in modern eyes were handed out as medicine. Desperation drove people to swallow whatever bitter promise might save them, even as their bodies deteriorated further under the weight of these toxic remedies. For women, childbirth was a gamble with life itself. In remote areas, as many as 1 in 4 mothers didn't survive. No sterile hospitals, no trained doctors, just hope and a prayer that your body wouldn't betray you. Dentistry was equally nightmarish. There were no numbing agents, no gentle hands. Teeth were pulled with crude tools, sometimes shattered in the process. Most lived for years with throbbing mouths, constant pain, until their teeth simply fell out. Getting sick or hurt in the Wild West wasn't just inconvenient, it could be a death sentence. Survival depended less on medicine and more on sheer luck. Even something minor, a twisted ankle, a deep scratch, could become a fight for your life. Bones healed crooked, wounds festered, pain became a permanent companion. Only the strong survive wasn't just a saying, it was the harsh law of the land. As your stomach growls, you make your way to the nearest restaurant, a loose term since it's likely just the back room of someone's home. The meal doesn't promise much. The meat is leathery, often spoiled despite being smoked or salted until almost inedible. Vegetables, if available, are boiled into shapeless mush. There are no food safety standards. No one checks for freshness. You eat because you must, not because you want to. Food poisoning and dysentery are almost routine. And while you chew, you overhear murmured conversations, whispers of Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, and the dangers of traveling alone. The truth is messier than the legends. While the violence of Native Americans is often exaggerated in stories, the real aggression came from settlers and soldiers, systematically displacing indigenous peoples from their land. But still, the frontier was a powder keg of tension, desperation, resistance, and survival clashing in bloody bursts on both sides. Outlaws weren't just a myth, they were an ever-present threat. Law enforcement was thin, sometimes non-existent. One sheriff might be tasked with keeping order across hundreds or thousands of square miles. Justice, if you could call it that, was often meted out by mobs. No trials, no second chances. If someone decided you were guilty of theft, of lying, of simply being in the wrong place, you might not live to see nightfall. A rope, a tree, and silence. After lunch, you stop by the general store. It's a small place, stocked with necessities, but the prices nearly knock you back. A can of peaches, a rare treat, might cost what would now be $20. Everything here is expensive, hard-earned, and quickly consumed. And what the store doesn't sell in goods, it shows in truth. Isolation. There's no regular mail. Newspapers arrive weeks, sometimes months, too late to matter. Letters from family back east are a rare blessing, if they come at all. Many settlers never heard from their loved ones again after moving west. No phone calls, no photographs, just fading memories and the long, cold ache of absence. You begin to understand why so many cracked under the weight of this life. It wasn't just the physical hardship, it was the emotional loneliness, the constant fear, the sense that every day you might vanish into history without a whisper, and no one would ever know. The crushing weight of isolation seeped into every corner of frontier life, quietly breaking spirits long before it broke bodies. Days blurred into weeks without a familiar voice beyond your own echo. The silence, once serene, grew heavy and haunted, fueling depression, drawing many into the numbing grip of alcohol, and for some, ending in the irreversible darkness of suicide. By late afternoon, the sky begins to shift. You glance toward the horizon and see heavy, dark clouds forming a silent wall. On the frontier, the weather wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a looming threat, unpredictable and merciless. There were no forecasts, no early warnings. Storms swept in like predators, blizzards that imprisoned families until death came quietly in the cold, tornadoes that erased entire towns in minutes, floods that swallowed wagon trains whole, and droughts turned life-sustaining crops into brittle, dying husks. Even if you were fortunate enough to call someplace home, it offered little real safety. The structures, hastily thrown together with sod, logs, or scrap wood, could barely hold off the wind, let alone protect against the bitter freeze or the sweltering heat. In the dead of winter, it wasn't unusual to see frost forming inside your house. In the peak of summer, the air in the upper rooms could become suffocating, a slow roast under a blazing sun. As the storm creeps closer, you turn back toward your cabin, each step faster than the last. On the way, a few men pass you, heading toward the mine. You give them a silent nod, knowing full well they may not return. Mining was a slow kind of gamble with death. Tunnels collapsing, gases poisoning the lungs before anyone could scream, accidental explosions, and machines that didn't forgive even the smallest mistake. And even for those who survived the daily risks, the long-term consequences were brutal. Black lung, mercury poisoning, broken bodies aged before their time. But the danger wasn't unique to miners. Farmers lost limbs to primitive machinery. Ranchers were trampled or gored by the livestock they depended on. Loggers, working among falling trees and spinning saws, died at some of the highest rates of all. On the frontier, your work didn't just shape your days, it threatened to end them. You reach your cabin just as the rain begins, cold and relentless. The roof leaks, buckets are placed under familiar drips, and yet this is a chance to collect water. Clean water was precious beyond words. Most settlers drank from the same muddy streams their animals used. Illness, often born in a single swallow, crept in unseen and killed fast. You sit down on the creaking floorboards, listening to the rain strike the roof like a quiet drumbeat of survival. And in that still moment, it hits you. The Wild West wasn't a land of glory. It was a crucible, a place where myths were forged from pain and where survival was the only triumph. There were no heroes here, just people enduring. Night comes quickly without electricity. You light a candle, the flame small and fragile. You watch it closely. One wrong move, one spark, and your entire world could turn to ash. There were no fire trucks, no alarms, just fire and loss. As you lie down, wrapped in a blanket that barely holds off the chill, you realize you haven't truly rested in days. Not really, because here on the edge of everything, rest isn't peace, it's vulnerability. And still, tomorrow, you will rise again, because that's what survival demands. You prepare for bed, utterly drained from just one day in the unforgiving Wild West. Your muscles scream from the relentless physical strain, your stomach churns from the rough, unfamiliar food, and your mind, your poor, overstimulated mind, can barely hold itself together after a full day of watching, listening, bracing for the next threat. Out here, danger doesn't announce itself. It waits, silently, constantly. As you lie on the scratchy mattress trying to still your thoughts, the darkness presses in, and you can't help but wonder, will you even make it through tomorrow? Or will you become just another nameless soul lost to this brutal land, another forgotten story swallowed by the silence of the frontier? Outside your cabin, the wind shrieks across the open land, a low, mournful cry that rattles the window panes and claws at the door. It's more than just a sound, it's a reminder of how small you are, of how alone you are, of how merciless this wilderness can be. Tomorrow will come, yes, if you're lucky enough to see it. And with it will come every hardship you face today, and perhaps new trials you haven't even begun to imagine. Because here in the Wild West, survival is never promised. It's not a birthright, it's a battle, fought day by day, hour by hour, wound by wound. Every breath you take is something you've earned through pain most people today could hardly fathom. When morning finally breaks, soft light filters through the splintered cracks in your cabin walls. You didn't sleep much. No one really does. Your bones protest as you rise from the stiff bedding, every movement an echo of yesterday's suffering. But there's no time to recover, no space for comfort. The West doesn't wait, it demands. And as you step out into the cool air, you remember yesterday's brutal lesson. This place doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how strong you were back home. Out here, you start from nothing every single day. Say today, you've decided to leave town. Maybe you're off to another settlement, joining a wagon train, or just pushing forward into the unknown. Whatever your reason, travel across the frontier in the 1870s is nothing like the journeys we know today. Yes, by now, the Transcontinental Railroad exists, a steel spine linking east to west. But unless you've got wealth, a luxury few settlers ever taste, you won't be climbing aboard. That train is for someone else's story. Yours is written in dust and sweat and broken wheels. If you own a horse, count yourself blessed, but remember, that blessing came at a price. A good horse costs more than many make in months, and it doesn't end there. Saddles, bridles, feed, care. Out here, veterinary treatment is often just a loaded gun and a hard goodbye. And riding? Riding isn't some gallant ride across rolling hills. It's long hours with a raw saddle rubbing skin raw, your body swaying to the gait until your legs go numb. Even the best riders aren't spared. And if your horse spooks, a shadow, a snake, a snap of wind, you could be thrown, left bleeding and broken in a place where help doesn't come. No horse? Then you're traveling by wagon, if you can find one or afford the upkeep. But forget the cheerful pioneers of old paintings. Real wagon travel is a test of endurance. No suspension, no mercy. Every rock is a blow, every rut a jolt. The nausea hits hard, turning every mile into a misery. Some call it wagon sickness. Most just grit their teeth and suffer through. And the road itself, if you're lucky, it's a dusty trail left behind by someone who came before and survived. If not, it's just wilderness, raw, unpredictable, and waiting to test your every step. After a heavy rain, the trail transformed into a nightmare. Muddy quagmires so deep that wagons sank to their axles, wheels spinning uselessly in the thick, sucking sludge. And when the skies stayed dry, the air filled with choking dust. It clung to your clothes, stung your eyes, and filled your lungs until you could barely breathe, let alone speak. Each step forward was either a slow, grueling crawl through muck or a blinded stumble through a haze of grit. Wagons broke down constantly, wooden wheels cracked, and iron axles snapped under the strain, often miles from the nearest settlement. There was no help coming. You fixed it yourself, or you were stranded. Sometimes for days, sometimes forever. Let's say you've decided to take the full plunge, to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train and set out along the famous Oregon Trail, a name that would echo through history, not just for its promise of new beginnings, but for its cost in blood and grief. This was no ordinary journey. The Oregon Trail stretched over 2,000 miles and was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the roughly 400,000 souls who dared to attempt it between the 1840s and 1860s, nearly 1 in 10 never made it to the other side. It earned a grim nickname, the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that for every mile of that trail, 10 to 15 people died. Picture that, a grave every 350 feet for 2,000 miles. The road west was lined with crude wooden crosses, hastily piled stone markers, and mounds of earth, many with no names, no farewell, just sorrow left behind in the dust. The dead didn't always get a proper burial. Sometimes there wasn't time, or the ground was too hard, or wild animals came too quickly. Families would lay loved ones to rest and then keep walking, their hearts shattered, the grief buried as deep as the body, because survival demanded it. Disease was the true killer on the trail, a silent and ruthless predator. Cholera, spread through contaminated water, struck fast and mercilessly. Imagine waking up beside someone who seemed perfectly fine, laughing, eating breakfast, and by sundown, you're digging their grave. There was no real medicine, no cure. Wagon trains could lose dozens in a single outbreak, and nothing could be done except pray you weren't next. Other illnesses, dysentery, typhoid, mountain fever, tore through families, leaving children gasping in their mother's arms. Some families buried multiple children before ever seeing the horizon of the new land they had hoped would bring them life. And then came the rivers. Treacherous, icy, uncaring. The wagons weren't built to float, but they had to cross anyway. Some rivers had ferries, some had fords, but many didn't. The pioneers had to attempt the impossible, turning wagons into makeshift boats. Too often, they failed. A single miscalculation, a sudden current, and everything was lost. Supplies, animals, loved ones. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers swallowed hundreds of lives. Their names still echo in old journals and whispered stories, not as pathways, but as watery graves. Ironically, the danger that loomed so large in the imagination, attacks by Native Americans, was largely a myth. Most tribes offered kindness, food, water, help with river crossings. The real violence came from within the journey itself, from broken bones, overturned wagons, fire, disease, and despair. Gun accidents were terrifyingly common. People carried weapons for hunting and protection, but many had never used them. One careless moment, one sudden jolt of the wagon, and someone was dead. A child, a friend, yourself. But perhaps the deepest wound wasn't physical, it was emotional. Imagine burying your child at sunrise and being back on the trail by noon. There was no time for mourning, no pause for heartbreak. Grief had to be silenced, stored away like extra rations because the wagon had to keep moving. The land was vast, and winter didn't wait for tears. By the end of the journey, those who survived were forever changed. Not because they had reached a promised land, but because of everything they had lost to get there. Each day's delay wasn't just inconvenient, it was a gamble with death. Every hour lost meant winter crept closer, threatening to seal the mountain passes with snow and strand entire families in unforgiving wilderness. The weight of this looming deadline, combined with relentless grief and punishing physical hardship, slowly crushed many spirits. The road west didn't just break bodies, it broke minds. Some travelers, overwhelmed by despair, took their own lives rather than face another step in a journey that seemed endless. And even if you defied the odds and survived the trek to California or Oregon, survival didn't mean salvation. Many arrived with nothing left, no money, no food, no strength. Every resource had been poured into reaching the promised land, only to find that the promise came with fine print. Instead of golden opportunity, they met exhaustion, sickness, and the cold indifference of a land that owed them nothing. But say you never aimed so far. Suppose your journey was just to a nearby town or settlement. Even then, danger lurked at every turn. Outlaws roamed the roads like wolves, hunting for the vulnerable. A lone traveler or a small group was an easy mark. Robbery wasn't just possible, it was expected. And while fiction would later romanticize the stagecoach heists, for those who lived it, the fear was all too real. Nature itself was an unforgiving adversary. One moment of misjudgment and a flash flood could wipe out your path or your life. The brutal heat of desert summers could leave travelers delirious, parched, and dead by midday. Winter storms didn't just delay travelers, they buried them. And in the darkest chapters of westward expansion, like the tragedy of the Donner Party, some were forced into the most unthinkable acts just to cling to life. Even finding your way wasn't guaranteed. There were no reliable maps, no GPS, only word-of-mouth directions, ambiguous landmarks, and the hope that your guide knew what they were doing. Many didn't. To get lost in the wilderness was often a death sentence. Supplies dwindled, hope faded, and the vast, empty landscape became a silent executioner. But as you move through this treacherous world, another truth quietly reveals itself, one rarely shown in movies or textbooks. The frontier wasn't just white, it was a patchwork of humanity, raw, real, and remarkable in its diversity. Chinese laborers laid the bones of the railroad, dug deep into mines, and opened shops in dusty towns. Mexican families lived on land that was once theirs, long before it was ever called America. Black cowboys, often erased from popular memory, made up nearly a quarter of ranch hands. Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians all brought with them languages, songs, and stories. And above all, the land itself belonged to native nations, each with their own rich cultures, each facing the violence and dislocation that came with this new wave of expansion. But diversity didn't mean unity. It didn't mean fairness. The West was as much a crucible of conflict as it was of courage. Chinese workers faced vicious racism and were pushed into the most dangerous jobs for a fraction of the pay. Mexican landowners lost their homes not in battle, but through courtrooms and corrupt deals. The great melting pot of the frontier often burned more than it blended. This was the true Wild West, not a myth, not a movie, but a raw and ruthless reality. one where survival was uncertain, justice was uneven, and every mile walked was a test of body, heart, and spirit. Black Americans who journeyed westward in search of freedom from the suffocating grip of Southern racism often found that the frontier offered no true escape, only a different face of the same cruelty. The promise of a new beginning was quickly dimmed by familiar exclusion. Though they poured their sweat and skill into building the West, ranching cattle, mining minerals, and raising towns from the dust, their contributions were often ignored, their humanity dismissed. Doors to opportunity remained closed, social circles stayed shut, and once again they found themselves surviving on the margins of a society they had helped create. For Native Americans, however, the Western expansion was not simply a broken promise, it was annihilation. Imagine a continent once teeming with 15 million indigenous souls, reduced to fewer than 300,000 by the turn of the 20th century. Not by accident, but by design. Disease swept through villages like wildfire. Armed conflicts, always uneven, shattered families and nations. Forced relocation tore them from the lands their ancestors had walked for generations, depositing them into unfamiliar, infertile territory, stripped of resources and dignity. And still, the cruelty didn't end with land theft or warfare. The very essence of Native identity was targeted. Children were forcibly taken from their homes, stripped of their language, cut off from their traditions, and placed in schools built to erase who they were. Kill the Indian, save the man, they were told. The brutal irony? What was offered in return was not civilization, but silence, of culture, of memory, of voice. The popular tales of cowboys and noble showdowns blurred all of this. They painted caricatures where there were once complex human stories, of peace offers rejected, of alliances betrayed, of violence born not from savagery, but from broken promises and unyielding desperation. As you travel deeper into this history, another face of the frontier comes into focus, one rarely given her due. The women. Not the polished belles or dainty schoolmarms of old Western films, but women whose hands were calloused, whose backs were strong, whose resilience bordered on the superhuman. Frontier women were warriors in their own right. They did not merely support, they built, they protected, they endured. They rose before dawn shouldering tasks meant for two. By morning, they might be tilling fields, by afternoon, aiding in childbirth, by evening, defending their homes with rifles if necessary. And then came the dinner, the children, the night, and the next endless day. Loss, too, was their constant companion. Many buried husbands far too soon, claimed by accident, illness, or violence. And then, without time to mourn, they carried on, ran the farms, raised the children, held the world together while their hearts quietly broke. The frontier was no place for the weak. But strength on this land didn't always come from muscle or gunpowder. Sometimes, it came from the quiet, relentless determination to survive when everything tried to break you. Despite the essential roles they played in shaping frontier life, women in the American West lived under the heavy shadow of systemic inequality. Their contributions were undeniable, yet their rights were practically non-existent. In most states and territories, a married woman could not vote, could not own property in her name, and had no legal claim to her children in the event of a divorce. Her identity, in the eyes of the law, was tethered to her husband's name, his choices, his will. Domestic violence was not just overlooked, it was normalized. It was labeled a private matter, tucked away behind closed doors where bruises faded in silence, and cries for help were dismissed as disruptions to domestic order. Legal protection was a fantasy for many women, especially those trapped in violent homes with no safe exit. For single women, the road was no easier. Their independence was often seen as unnatural, and their opportunities sharply limited. Teaching, though considered respectable, paid poorly, and for many women it was a short-lived career. Marriage often meant resignation, not just from work, but from autonomy. Some women carved out paths of resilience. They ran boarding houses, worked as nurses, or built modest businesses as dressmakers or milliners. These ventures, though small, were acts of quiet rebellion, proof that dignity and survival could coexist. And then there were the soiled doves, a euphemism that barely conceals the harsh truths of prostitution on the frontier. History has painted their stories in romantic hues, but the reality was stark. Many turned to this line of work out of desperation, widowed, abandoned, or simply with no other means of survival. The risks were brutal. Physical abuse, addiction, and disease haunted their every step. Even those who managed to earn a living often faced social exile, barred from re-entering a world that demanded purity while offering no protection. Yet somehow, in the cracks of this harsh world, some women found a flicker of freedom. With fewer women in the West, communities often valued their presence more, and in rare cases, treated them with greater respect. Marriage prospects improved, safety sometimes followed. And in a few forward-thinking territories like Wyoming and Utah, women were granted the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment, a recognition, however limited, of their irreplaceable role in building the West. As you continue your journey across the rugged landscape, another question emerges. Who upheld the law in this untamed place? The answer is as fragmented as the frontier itself. In more developed towns and cities, law enforcement took some form: sheriffs, marshals, deputies. But beyond those borders, in the sweeping rural expanses, law and order were fragile illusions. A single sheriff might be tasked with policing thousands of square miles, relying on hastily gathered posses of armed citizens to chase criminals or settle disputes. There were no quick reinforcements, no backup units, just one man, a badge, and the weight of an entire county on his shoulders. Town marshals worked within city limits, often for meager pay and with targets on their backs. Some were driven by duty, others by ego, and a few by the thrill of power in a lawless land. Even the most legendary lawmen, Wyatt Earp among them, often blurred the line between justice and self-interest, straddling both sides of the law depending on the day. Federal marshals had broader jurisdiction but limited manpower. They dealt with major crimes, mail robbery, counterfeiting, organized violence, but their reach was far from universal. And so, justice in the West was as unpredictable as the land itself. For every town that found peace, there were others where power, not principle, ruled. In this landscape, survival demanded more than courage. It required endurance, grit, and sometimes a painful compromise with one's own conscience. The legendary U.S. Marshals you've seen in Western movies, those lone gunslingers who swagger into town and bring justice with a glare and a quick draw, largely myth, romanticized relics of Hollywood storytelling. In truth, law in the Wild West was more often a whispered rumor than a practiced reality. In many remote areas, there was no sheriff riding in to save the day. Justice, if you could call it that, came from the hands of the community. When crime struck and no badge was in sight, people took matters into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed, not out of heroism, but out of desperation. Sometimes they did what needed to be done, but just as often they were swept away by anger, fear, and prejudice. A neighbor's grudge, a stranger's accent, or even a misunderstood glance could turn fatal when a mob felt justified. Forget the romantic duels at high noon. The iconic quick-draw gunfight was more fiction than fact. Real frontier violence was messier, more spontaneous, and heartbreakingly mundane. A bar fight that spiraled into bloodshed. A drunken rage turned deadly at home. Arguments over cattle, water rights, or land boundaries that escalated far too quickly. Punishment, when it came, was swift and brutal by today's standards. Hanging was common, not just for murder or rape, but even for theft if you stole something as prized as a horse. Jails did exist, but they were rough, often little more than wooden sheds or converted rooms with barred windows and dirt floors. Disease, malnutrition, and inmate violence claimed many before a sentence ever played out. Evening creeps in. You're weary, sore, and desperately in need of rest. If you're fortunate enough to stumble into a town, you might find a hotel or boarding house. But don't let the word hotel fool you. Your room, if available, will be no more than a narrow space with a creaky bed, likely crawling with bed bugs, and a washstand holding a chipped basin and a pitcher of lukewarm water. A wooden chair in the corner if you're lucky. The outhouse is out back, shared by every guest. The walls are paper thin, so you'll hear every cough, whisper, or snore next door. And in busy times, you might be asked to share your bed with a complete stranger. No fresh linens, no guarantees of hygiene. Just a blanket, a flickering oil lamp, and the sounds of a restless, uncertain night. All this could cost you between 25 cents and $1, a steep price when every coin is hard-earned. For many, the cost was too great. They slept in barns, stables, or out in the open under the stars. But the wilderness held its own dangers. If you camped, you had to build a fire, not too big, not too small. A fire too large could ignite the prairie, too small and you'd freeze, or worse, go unseen and vulnerable. You'd prepare your dinner from what little you had and sleep on the hard ground, every creak in the forest or howl in the distance keeping you half awake. Indigenous people, Army Scouts, and seasoned travelers knew how to camp with care. But newcomers, naive, unprepared, often learned the hard way. A single mistake could end in disaster. Out here, the margin for error was razor thin. This was life in the Wild West. Not a tale of glory, but a quiet, constant reckoning with danger, discomfort, and the raw edge of human endurance. A shelter built too small might not hold warmth through the long, bitter night. The cold doesn't just creep in, it claims you inch by inch until your breath fogs and your fingertips numb. Hypothermia wasn't some distant medical term, it was a nightly threat. Cooking over an open flame required practiced instinct. Most had none. Meals turned out blackened on the outside, raw at the core, barely edible, but necessary for survival. As night settles in, full and absolute, the darkness swallows everything. There are no streetlights, no hum of electricity, no gentle glow from distant windows. Just pitch black silence, broken by unsettling sounds. Coyotes howl in the distance, strange birds cry into the void, and the wind whispers through tall grass or creaking trees like a voice trying to speak. For those raised under modern lights and surrounded by urban noise, the silence here is alien, heavy, oppressive. The unknown stretches out in every direction, and with it a primal fear most of us have forgotten how to name. Sleep does not come easily. Not here. Not when the night feels like a living thing watching you. Diaries from the time speak of this. The bone-deep exhaustion not just from physical toil, but from a kind of sleepless dread. People tossed and turned not just from the hard ground beneath them, but from what might be moving just beyond their sight. Attacks by native groups were rare but terrifying, often feared at dawn, the moment of most vulnerability. But nature too was a threat. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, all might prowl close to camp, sniffing for scraps. Venomous snakes and scorpions seeking warmth sometimes found their way inside bedrolls. You slept knowing that even in your rest you were never safe. Even when nothing came, the mind raced, the body tensed, the heart thudded in a quiet panic. Modern comforts, locks, alarms, a neighbor's light shining next door, these didn't exist. Vulnerability was the rule, not the exception. And so, as you finally close your eyes, you do so not in peace, but in submission to the unknown, to the fear, to the hope that you'll wake up. Because the truth of the trail, the unspoken truth, is this. Every night could be your last. The day's journey replays in your mind, dusty and relentless. Travel in the Wild West was not the grand adventure painted in novels or film. It was unglamorous, punishing, and perilous. The wagon wheels creaked with each mile, and each wrong turn could mean death. Skills were learned in hardship, how to navigate without maps, repair a broken axle in a storm, or handle a misfiring weapon. One mistake, one moment of fatigue or ignorance, and you could pay with your life. Outside, the night deepens. The wind moans louder, like some mournful spirit crossing the plain. You press your body tighter into your blanket, if only to shut out the sound. Tomorrow is unknown. If you make it through the night, perhaps you'll find a new chance. Or perhaps, like so many before you, you'll fade into the landscape, an unmarked grave along the trail, your story lost to the dust. The Wild West had no patience for weakness, no forgiveness, no do-overs, just a relentless test of will, every hour of every day. And then, somehow, the dawn comes. You wake, alive. That alone is a kind of triumph. Your body aches from the cold, from the ground, from the fear. But you're still here. You made it. And in the West, that matters. You rub the sleep from your eyes as the pale light spreads across the horizon, and you wonder what the day holds. Perhaps you'll gamble everything on a dream. Head to a booming mining town where fortunes are said to lie just beneath the earth. You've heard the stories. Gold in California, silver in Nevada, riches pulled from Colorado's bones, tales of men with nothing who found nuggets as big as fists and became legends overnight. But you know better now. The West doesn't give freely, it demands everything, and even then, it offers no guarantees. What these stories often leave out are the brutal, soul-crushing realities that awaited those who dared to chase mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your luck at mining. What would that actually mean for your body, your spirit, your life? First, you'd need to stake a claim, a process that sounds simple until you realize most of the easily accessible gold-rich areas were already snatched up decades earlier. By the 1870s, finding unclaimed land with real promise was like hunting ghosts. You'd scour remote terrain, hungry and exhausted, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, you've stumbled onto something that could change your life. If you were lucky enough to find a potential site, your next stop was the nearest government office to register your claim, and that journey alone could be treacherous. Once there, you'd pay steep fees, sometimes more than you could afford. But you'd pay anyway, desperate to hold on to your sliver of hope. Then the real work began. And work doesn't even begin to describe what mining demanded. It was grueling, punishing labor that broke bodies and tested wills. If you were placer mining, you'd spend endless hours hunched over icy streams, your fingers numb and bleeding as you sifted gravel and sediment for a glint of gold. Your back would burn with pain, your hands cracked from cold and friction. You'd work until you couldn't feel your legs, only to end the day with a few flakes of gold that might buy a stale loaf of bread. And if you dared to venture into hard rock mining, into the belly of the mountains themselves, the danger only grew more vicious. There were no modern safety regulations, no protective gear, no guarantees. You dug deep into unstable rock, praying it wouldn't collapse around you. And often, it did, without warning. Cave-ins crushed men mid-sentence, burying them in darkness before they could scream. The air itself was a silent killer. Poisonous gases, odorless, invisible, crept through the shafts, stealing breath from lungs already struggling in the dust-choked tunnels. One breath too deep and you'd collapse with no idea why your limbs refused to move. Blasting through rock with black powder or dynamite was a dance with death. A miscalculation, a spark too early, and your body could be torn apart by the very explosion meant to bring you closer to fortune. Fingers, hands, eyes, sacrificed in seconds. Many never saw it coming. The noise was relentless, deafening. Day after day, the pounding and explosions stripped away hearing, leaving many miners in a world of permanent silence. But even if you survived the blasts and cave-ins, the long-term damage was merciless. You breathed in fine rock dust with every breath, never seeing it accumulate in your lungs, until one day you couldn't breathe at all. Silicosis turned strong men into wheezing shells, their bodies slowly strangling from the inside out. Mercury, used to extract gold, seeped into your skin, your bones, your brain. It made your hands shake uncontrollably. It muddled your thoughts. It stole your identity, inch by inch. And for those in copper or lead mines, toxic metals built up silently in your blood. There were no immediate symptoms, just a creeping weakness, a dull ache, a sense that something inside you was quietly giving out. And by the time it showed itself, it was too late. You were already dying. The dream of riches lured thousands to these unforgiving places, but the earth rarely gave freely. More often, it took everything. In the 1870s, the mining industry was a brutal world where safety was a forgotten word. Mine owners cared only about the bottom line, treating injuries not as tragedies, but as inevitable costs of doing business. Worker safety? It was an afterthought, a luxury they could not afford. Injuries were dismissed as just part of the job, harsh, unyielding, and often deadly. Medical care for injured miners was scarce and inadequate. A serious wound or broken bone didn't just mean pain. It meant the end of a miner's career, with no safety net to catch him. No disability support, no workers' compensation, only the cold reality of losing your livelihood and being cast aside. Despite the relentless dangers and backbreaking labor, what reward awaited these men? The romantic tales of striking gold were few and far between. Most miners barely earned enough to survive. By the 1870s, the hopeful independent prospector had largely been replaced by wage laborers working long, grueling days for $2 to $3, barely enough to cover the bare essentials. Strikingly, studies reveal a bitter truth. Saloon owners, storekeepers, and even prostitutes often made more money than the very miners whose sweat and toil kept the frontier towns alive. Mining towns themselves were harsh, chaotic places. Picture a settlement dominated by young, single men, far from family and stability, working under dangerous conditions. Alcohol flowed freely, with residents consuming several times the amount drunk by the average American today. Violence was woven into daily life. Brawls, stabbings, and shootings were alarmingly common. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Streets and waterways choked with human waste and garbage, festering in the heat and drawing swarms of flies. Diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread like wildfire. The stench was overpowering during warmer months, a constant reminder of the squalor. Even if you struck valuable ore, turning it into cash was another battlefield. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often cruelly exploitative. Many mining towns lacked banks entirely, forcing miners to carry their gold dust or ore themselves, making them prime targets for robbery. Some saloons and general stores would buy gold, but miners were routinely shortchanged, forced to accept unfairly low prices because they had no other options. Where banks did exist, they were unstable and unregulated. Failures were common, wiping out life savings without warning. Many bankers were con artists, opening storefronts, collecting deposits, then vanishing into the night with the money. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, its value wildly fluctuating based on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills were everywhere, fooling even experienced merchants. The safest money was gold or silver coins, but carrying such wealth made miners walking targets for thieves and outlaws, ever lurking in the shadows. This was the reality behind the glittering promise of the mining frontier, a world of risk, hardship, and precarious survival, where every day could be your last and fortune was a fleeting dream. Perhaps, after reflecting on the harsh realities and heartbreak of mining, you consider ranching as an alternative path. In the booming cattle industry of the 1870s, the growing demand for beef in eastern cities painted a promising picture of opportunity and stability out west. It feels like a healthier, more respectable way to make a living. Yet ranching, while sidestepping some of mining's deadly health hazards, brought with it a harsh set of its own trials and risks. To start a ranch, you needed substantial money up front. Land to graze cattle, livestock to raise, equipment to maintain, and buildings to shelter animals and workers. Many aspiring ranchers plunged into deep debt, betting their futures on the uncertain mercy of weather and market prices. But nature had little patience for such bets. Droughts could parch the land and dry up watering holes, forcing ranchers to watch helplessly as their herds withered or to sell cattle at devastating losses. Winters were merciless. The Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 stands as a grim reminder, when up to 90% of cattle in northern ranges succumbed to freezing cold or starvation. Disease was an ever-present shadow. Texas fever, anthrax, and other contagious illnesses could wipe out entire herds overnight, with no effective treatments available in the 1870s. Wild predators, wolves, cougars, were constant threats, especially to vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, treacherous quicksand, and injury added to the perils faced by the cattle. The famed cattle drives, where herds were herded hundreds of miles to railroad hubs, were far from the romanticized adventures of popular culture. These were grueling, dangerous endeavors. Cowboys, far from the glamorous figures of film, were often young, poorly paid laborers working brutal 20-hour days. Exhausted beyond measure, they sometimes caught brief naps atop their horses while steering thousands of massive animals over rugged, unpredictable terrain. Every moment carried risk. River crossings could turn fatal if panicked animals caused crushing pileups, drowning cattle and riders alike. Stampedes, triggered by a sudden noise, lightning, or even a snapping twig, transformed these massive herds into unstoppable forces of destruction. Cowboys caught in the chaos were frequently trampled to death. Life as a cowboy was far from the freedom or glory imagined in Western myths. Most earned barely $30 a month for backbreaking, hazardous work. They were often very young, teenagers from impoverished families with few options. Many were Black, Mexican, or of mixed heritage, facing systemic discrimination that kept them confined to this difficult, often dangerous livelihood. The reality of ranching was a harsh blend of hope and hardship, where dreams were measured against storms, predators, and the relentless grind of labor under a vast, unforgiving sky. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with very little fresh food. Each meal was a reminder of scarcity, a far cry from the hearty feasts one might imagine. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies, improvised treatments born of desperation rather than science. Injuries common in such dangerous work often went untreated until they became life-threatening. The harsh reality was brutal. Many cowboys died young from wounds that festered, from exposure to harsh elements, or from sudden violence. The frontier didn't wait for healing. It demanded toughness, endurance, and a willingness to face death head-on. Perhaps ranching doesn't sound so appealing after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most basic human need, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. It seemed like a golden opportunity, a chance for those with little money to become landowners, to carve out a life of independence and hope. But the truth was far harsher than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound like plenty, but in the dry, unforgiving regions that made up most of the available land, it was often barely enough to support a family. The soil was tough, the rain scarce, and the sun relentless. Traditional farming methods brought from the east were useless here. Many settlers lacked knowledge of dry farming techniques crucial for survival. Starting a frontier farm demanded back-breaking labor. The very first job was building shelter, often a sod house, or soddy, crafted by cutting and stacking thick prairie turf since trees were rare. These homes were dark, damp, and leaky when rain came, frequently infested with insects and snakes. Without constant maintenance, they crumbled like fragile promises. Then came the grueling task of breaking the land for planting. The prairie sod, woven tightly by roots nurtured over centuries, was nearly impossible to plow with the simple tools settlers possessed. Preparing just a few acres for crops could take a year or more. The relentless labor left many farmers with permanent injuries, their bodies bearing the scars of the land's resistance. Once crops were planted, danger lurked everywhere. Drought could wither fields before the harvest. Torrential rains washed away seedlings or drowned entire plots. Early frosts might kill plants at the peak of hope. And swarms of grasshoppers, like living storms, devoured every green thing that even gnawing through wooden tool handles left unattended. Disease struck frontier farmers as mercilessly as the land itself. With no hired help and little support from neighbors, falling ill during critical times like planting or harvest could mean disaster. Sickness wasn't just personal suffering, it was a threat to the family's survival, a grim gamble with starvation. Life on the frontier was a relentless battle against nature and circumstance, where every success was hard-won and every setback could be fatal. The dream of a new life was shadowed by exhaustion, uncertainty, and a constant struggle to hold on. Women often worked in the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Their bodies bore the weight of life itself, even as they labored tirelessly, driven by necessity and an unyielding sense of duty. Every aching muscle, every moment of exhaustion was a silent testament to their strength and sacrifice. Farm accidents were common and often deadly. Homemade tools, crafted from what little was available, broke unexpectedly and caused grievous injuries. Animals, startled and panicked, sometimes trampled the very hands that fed and cared for them. Even the promise of a successful harvest could be overshadowed by sudden tragedy. Countless farmers met their end falling into grain storage bins, suffocating beneath the shifting, unforgiving masses of loose grain. Others perished when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed, burying them under tons of grain. The land that promised sustenance often turned deadly without warning. The isolation of frontier farms exacted a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors were miles away, visited only occasionally, and for many women, the silence was deafening. Some went months without speaking to anyone beyond their immediate family, the loneliness wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. Depression, anxiety, and what was then known as prairie madness plagued countless settlers, driving some to abandon their homesteads or, heartbreakingly, to take their own lives. For those who persevered through these hardships and actually produced crops, economic battles awaited. Transporting goods to distant markets was costly and arduous. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved, limiting opportunities and profits. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies exerted their power to keep crop prices artificially low, while charging exorbitant fees for transport, squeezing independent farmers from both ends. By the 1870s, a new option emerged on the frontier, working for wages in growing towns and industries. Perhaps this path promised more safety and stability compared to the high risks of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did spare workers some of the worst physical dangers and financial uncertainties of independent ventures, but it introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in factories, mills, and workshops faced horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was especially perilous. Track layers toiled under brutal conditions, facing accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion at alarming rates. Chinese workers, instrumental in building much of the transcontinental railroad, were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Their sacrifices were immense and often unrecognized. Working hours were long by today's standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days a week. Pay was meager, barely enough to survive. Child labor was widespread. Children as young as 8 or 9 worked alongside adults in many industries, suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Each day, the frontier was a battleground of endurance, resilience, and unspoken suffering, where survival was never guaranteed and every breath taken was hard-won. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who dared to speak out or organize for better conditions risked blacklisting, branded as troublemakers, shut out from employment anywhere in the region. In mining and lumber regions, company towns dominated, settlements where a single employer owned every house and business. Workers there paid inflated prices at the company's store, lived in company-owned homes, and sometimes received payment in scrip, a form of company currency that could only be spent within the company's own ecosystem. This system was a trap, a form of debt bondage that kept workers bound, unable to save enough to break free. Whether mining, ranching, farming, or laboring for wages, life on the frontier was unlike anything modern people might imagine. Time itself moved differently here, not by the ticking of clocks, but by the shifting of daylight, the changing of seasons, and the rhythms of nature. Without electric lights, most rose at dawn and slept soon after sunset, their days stretching and shrinking with the sun. Work wasn't divided into neat 8-hour shifts. It was measured by the tasks at hand. Fields had to be plowed, cattle herded, or extracted, no matter how long it took. During harvest or cattle roundup, people labored from first light until well past dark for weeks on end, with barely a moment to rest. Come winter, when fields lay barren and cattle needed little tending, there might be stretches of quiet, a pause in the endless toil. The modern obsession with punctuality barely mattered on the frontier. Few had clocks, and precision was rarely necessary. Morning or after dinner sufficed as markers of time for most. The arrival of stagecoaches and trains later brought stricter timekeeping, but for everyday life, time remained fluid. Entertainment was simple and scarce. After draining days of backbreaking labor, most had little energy left for complex amusements. Evenings often passed in quiet conversation around the fire, storytelling, or playing simple card games. Music lifted spirits when instruments and players were available. Fiddles, harmonicas, guitars providing the soundtrack for social dances that brought the community together. Books were treasures, scarce and precious. A single volume might be read aloud to groups of neighbors or passed hand to hand among families, worn thin from constant use. In the vast loneliness of the frontier, these moments of shared stories and songs became lifelines, tiny sparks of connection amid hardship and isolation. Newspapers, when available, were treasured lifelines, read over and over, every advertisement and notice dissected for glimpses into a world far beyond the dusty streets and endless plains. They were windows to a wider life, a lifeline to news, hope, and connection. Organized sports existed, but they were humble affairs compared to today's spectacles. Baseball was beginning to capture hearts, played with bare essentials on makeshift fields carved from the land. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting contests were not just pastimes, they were vital expressions of skill, pride, and survival. Each competition was a moment to shine, to prove worth in a harsh, unforgiving world. Children found joy in simplicity. Their games needed no fancy equipment. Tag, hide and seek, or their own rough versions of stickball made from whatever they could find. Laughter and camaraderie in the open air, innocent escapes from the daily grind. Holidays and community gatherings were rare treasures, moments when the relentless struggle paused. 4th of July celebrations could draw folks from miles away, transforming the frontier into a vibrant patchwork of picnics, speeches, spirited games, and dancing beneath the open sky. Harvest festivals marked triumph, the successful end of the year's toil, a reason to come together and rejoice. Religious holidays offered more than spiritual solace. They were vital breaks from ceaseless labor and worry, moments to catch breath and find shared hope. As the sun dips low and the day fades, you pause to reflect on the relentless demands of frontier life. Every task required double the effort, every success came at great risk, and comfort was a scarce luxury. This was a world where simple survival was a victory in itself. The people who endured here, and sometimes even thrived, were unlike many of us today. Their bodies bore incredible endurance, their hands knew the practical skills to face any emergency, and their minds held a steely resilience forged through constant hardship and loss. As darkness falls, a profound silence envelops the land, so deep you hear your heartbeat echoing in your ears. No engines roar, no machines hum, no screens glow. Only the whisper of the wind, the gentle buzz of insects, and the occasional call of a nightbird breaking the stillness. This quiet, alien to modern ears, was the true soundtrack of frontier nights. At times it comforted, a soft embrace against the vast loneliness. At others, it haunted with its stark emptiness. As sleep draws near, a question lingers. Could you have survived here? Not just a day, a week, but years, perhaps decades. The people who forged the American West were no perfect heroes from Hollywood tales. They were flesh and blood, facing staggering challenges, armed only with the tools and knowledge they possessed. Their story, unvarnished and free from romantic gloss, is a testament to raw human endurance, a toughness that would stretch many of us to our breaking point. The cool night air settles around you like a soft blanket. Above, the stars blaze in a brilliance nearly impossible to find in today's light-polluted skies. This was the frontier's gift, beauty seen fully and deeply, a quiet wonder that few in the modern world will ever know. The vast stretch of the Milky Way stretches across the night sky, a timeless bridge connecting you to the same stars your ancestors once gazed upon, generation after generation. It's a silent witness to their hopes, fears, and enduring spirit. Morning dawns once again over the rugged expanse of the Wild West. With it comes a relentless companion, hunger. Hunger was a constant thread woven into the daily fabric of frontier life, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to the rich, varied meals we take for granted today. To feed yourself here required grit, skill, and a touch of luck. The good news? Wild game was still abundant in many regions. Deer, elk, rabbits, birds, and birds could grace your table, if you possessed the know-how and the patience to hunt them. The bad news? Hunting demanded ammunition, a costly resource that was often better saved for protection against threats lurking beyond your door. The time spent stalking prey was time taken from other vital chores, a luxury few settlers could afford during the relentless demands of busy seasons. Most families leaned heavily on what they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. Beans, corn, and pork formed the backbone of the frontier diet. Calorie-rich, but monotonous, lacking the nourishment to keep body and soul fully healthy. Fresh fruits and vegetables were fleeting blessings, available only in brief seasonal windows. Winters were harsh and long, often leaving tables bare of anything green or fresh. This scarcity bred widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by the absence of vitamin C, was a silent predator during the cold months. It crept in with bleeding gums, loose teeth, and aching joints, symptoms that could spiral into a slow, painful death. Though settlers understood the disease, remedies were scarce, and prevention even scarcer. Other nutrient deficiencies stunted the growth of children and drained adults of vitality, shadowing families with chronic illness and hardship. Food preservation was not a choice, but a necessity. a battle fought every harvest to secure a foothold against the lean months ahead. Without refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly or transformed through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods extended edibility but robbed the food of flavor, texture, and vital nutrients. The heavy salt content often invited its own health troubles, including high blood pressure. Women became the unsung warriors of survival, dedicating endless hours to the laborious task of preserving the harvest. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented, fruits dried or sweetened with precious sugar, root vegetables tucked away in cool, dark root cellars. These acts of preservation were more than chores. They were lifelines. But storing food came with risks. Poorly preserved provisions could turn deadly, causing illness and sometimes death. Every jar sealed and every piece stored was a gamble against spoilage, a tension that weighed on every frontier family. In this unforgiving land, every meal was a victory earned through sweat, skill, and unwavering hope. The hunger you feel is not just for food, it's the hunger to endure, to survive, and to claim a place in this vast, wild world. Stored food on the frontier was never truly safe. It was a constant battle against tiny invaders. Rats, mice, and insects gnawed relentlessly, devouring large portions of precious supplies. Worse yet, their droppings contaminated whatever remained, turning what little food was left into a questionable feast. Most families accepted this grim reality with quiet resignation. Finding insect parts or rodent droppings mixed in with your flour or beans wasn't just a possibility, it was expected. There was simply no way around it. Cooking itself was a labor of love and sheer endurance. Meals were crafted over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that demanded constant attention and an endless supply of fuel. In the vast prairie where trees were scarce, women and children spent hours scavenging buffalo chips, dried piles of buffalo manure, or gathering twisted, dry grasses to keep the fires alive. Water was no casual convenience. It had to be hauled by hand, often hundreds of pounds a day, from wells or distant streams. Every drop was precious, used carefully for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. After all this effort, meals were simple and unimaginative. Nothing like the flavors and variety we enjoy today. Spices, those tiny jars of magic, were rare and costly luxuries, reserved for the rare celebratory dish, if used at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured like gold, hoarded and served only on special occasions. If a family kept a cow, fresh milk might be a seasonal blessing, flowing only when the cow was producing. For most children growing up here, their diet was repetitive and plain. Beans, salted meat, hard biscuits, a monotony that would shock modern nutritionists. Curiously, obesity was almost unheard of. The constant physical labor and scarcity of sugar kept people lean. But that leanness was often deceptive. Many frontier families suffered hidden malnutrition, enough to survive but never enough to thrive. Beyond the struggle for food, life on the frontier shaped childhood in ways difficult to imagine today. If you had been born into this world, your experience of growing up would have been harsh, pragmatic, and unlike the carefree youth of the modern age. Childhood itself held a different meaning in the 19th century, more about survival than play, responsibility over innocence. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to shoulder responsibilities far beyond simple chores. They were vital to their family's survival. This was no lesson in responsibility. It was a matter of life and death. From dawn till dusk, young hands tended livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, and watched over younger siblings. Their labor freed adults to wrestle with heavier burdens and relentless work. By the age of 10 or 12, these children were no longer children in the usual sense. They worked alongside adults, matching their pace and enduring their hardships. Boys trailed their fathers into the fields, barns, and workshops, absorbing skills through sweat and trial, not from books or formal teaching. Girls stood beside their mothers, mastering the intricate and exhausting art of managing a frontier household. Sewing clothes, preserving food, making candles and soap, tasks that demanded precision and endurance. Childhood was swallowed quickly by the demands of survival. They were witnesses to the full spectrum of life. Births, deaths, the harsh slaughter of animals for food, and at times the violence that erupted within their communities. Shielding them was not an option. Understanding and adaptation were expected. Formal education, as we know it today, was a scarce luxury. In established towns, schools might open for just a few cold winter months. staffed by a single teacher, often barely more educated than the pupils, tasked with instructing children aged 5 to 17, all packed into one cramped room. The schoolhouses themselves were austere, drafty and unheated in winter, unbearably hot in summer. Textbooks were rare, paper precious, and writing slates were endlessly erased and reused. Discipline was harsh and swift. A whisper, a forgotten lesson, a moment of restlessness could bring lashings or beatings. In the most isolated homesteads, formal schooling was often absent entirely. Families struggled to provide whatever instruction they could with whatever books or knowledge they possessed. For many frontier children, education meant practical wisdom, reading weather signs, tracking game, preparing the soil, treating wounds, lessons that meant survival. Yet despite their hardiness, the harshness of the frontier claimed its toll. Child mortality was heartbreakingly high. 1 in 4 children never reached adulthood, with the greatest danger lurking in those fragile first 5 years. In this world, childhood was brief and fierce, defined not by play and innocence, but by relentless work, harsh realities, and the fragile hope of making it through another day. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, were ruthless killers in the 1870s, routinely snatching young children from their families or leaving them permanently disabled. Accidents claimed even more young lives, as child safety was a foreign concept in a world where survival demanded constant risk-taking and hardiness. The psychological weight of such loss on children and parents is almost unimaginable today. Most children grew up surrounded by death, watching siblings fade away one after another. Parents lived with the harrowing expectation that not all their children would survive, and in a haunting reflection of this reality, it was common to give a newborn the same name as a lost older sibling. Though this practice might seem strange or even cold now, it reveals a starkly different, more resigned relationship with mortality in a time when death was a constant, almost familiar presence. Nothing underscores the chasm between frontier life and our modern world more clearly than the approach to health and medicine. Fall ill or suffer an injury in the 1870s West, and you would find yourself in a reality vastly different from today's medical care. Professional doctors were rare. Some communities had none at all. Those who did practice often had only the barest training, perhaps a short apprenticeship or a few months at medical college, their knowledge still rooted in outdated theories like humoral balance, concepts that echoed medieval medicine more than anything resembling modern science. In the absence of professional care, healing was left largely to home remedies and folk medicine, administered by local healers, often women, who carried centuries-old traditions from diverse cultures. Some herbal treatments held real medicinal value, but many were ineffective at best, harmful at worst. Common medical practices of the time included bloodletting, which drained already weakened patients of precious strength, and purgatives that induced severe diarrhea, believed to expel bad humors. Poultices, often made from questionable substances, were slapped on wounds, sometimes inviting infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum and opium tincture was a widespread remedy for pain, but it frequently led to addiction. Mercury compounds were prescribed for a variety of ailments despite their well-known toxicity. Even when treatments held some promise, impure and unregulated medicines made things worse. Without pharmaceutical oversight, commercial remedies varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines marketed as cure-alls were little more than alcohol, offering only the fleeting escape of intoxication rather than real healing. Surgery in frontier conditions was a nightmare. Without effective anesthesia, limited to whiskey, opium, or raw alcohol, patients endured unimaginable agony during operations. Sterilization was either unknown or ignored, turning even routine procedures into a gamble with infection and death. This harsh reality of frontier medicine reminds us how fragile life was, how close to the edge people lived every day, and how survival often depended on luck as much as strength or skill. Amputation was the grim reality for serious limb injuries on the frontier, done with crude saws and knives that might be wiped clean but were never truly sterilized. The sheer brutality of such procedures left survivors with lifelong scars, both physical and emotional. Childbirth exposed the starkest divide between frontier life and modern medical care. Women usually gave birth at home, relying on midwives if they were lucky, or simply on female relatives. Without prenatal checkups or modern diagnostics, complications went unnoticed until crisis struck during labor. Breech births, hemorrhages, and other emergencies that hospitals now manage with routine ease often ended in the tragic death of mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality rates were staggering, around 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than today's developed nations. Many women faced each pregnancy with the heavy knowledge it could be their last. The diaries and letters of frontier men reveal haunting accounts of raising children alone after losing their wives in childbirth, a sorrow etched into family histories. The harsh combination of poor nutrition, relentless physical labor, lack of preventive care, and primitive medical practices meant frontier settlers faced health outcomes more akin to those in today's developing countries than in modern America. Life expectancy at birth hovered below 40 years, and even those who survived childhood often carried chronic illnesses by their 50s if they lived that long at all. Yet, beyond these physical trials, a deeper hardship was the crushing isolation. In a time when instant communication was unimaginable, solitude shaped lives profoundly. Staying connected with distant family or friends depended entirely on slow, uncertain travel. Letters could take weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. News traveled by word of mouth, often distorted, delayed, or lost. Major events might remain unknown for months in remote settlements. This gap in information bred a mindset focused intensely on the local, immediate world. Distant happenings felt abstract, even irrelevant compared to the pressing daily struggles nearby. For those from more socially rich backgrounds, the isolation was suffocating. Women raised amid close-knit communities often found themselves utterly alone for days or weeks while husbands traveled for work or supplies. Their diaries reveal a profound loneliness and mental strain born of endless silence and the absence of adult conversation. Such isolation sometimes led to what was grimly called prairie madness, a constellation of severe depression, anxiety, and in extreme cases, psychosis. The relentless solitude, exhausting labor, and harsh environment pushed people beyond their limits, testing the endurance of body and mind in ways few could imagine. Some individuals became violent toward their families or took their own lives. Others simply gave up and returned east, unable to bear the mental toll of frontier life. Even in more settled communities, social contact was scarce, limited by vast distances and scarce time. Visiting a neighbor often meant walking or riding several miles each way, a daunting task when every ounce of time and energy was already stretched thin. Formal social gatherings were rare and usually revolved around church services, seasonal holidays, or communal work events like barn raisings and harvest festivals. Churches served a vital role, not only as places of worship, but also as social hubs, schools, and pillars of mutual support. Even those with little religious conviction often took part in church activities, drawn by the sense of belonging they offered. Religious leaders, whether ministers, priests, or lay preachers, wore many hats, acting as teachers, mediators in disputes, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked crucial milestones in frontier life. Building a school, church, or meeting hall symbolized a commitment to permanence rather than fleeting opportunity. These structures helped transform transient mining camps or trading posts into real towns, forging shared identities and long-term goals. The formation of local governments, even in their simplest forms, signaled the transition from frontier chaos to organized community. Survival in such harsh conditions demanded strong cooperation. Mutual aid and collective action were often the only ways forward. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large building projects beyond their individual means. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, helping neighbors gather crops before weather could destroy them. Search parties sprang up immediately when children went missing. These acts of cooperation revealed a fundamental truth: no one could survive the frontier entirely alone. This interdependence existed alongside the fierce individualism celebrated in frontier tales. Both were essential. Self-reliance was critical for daily survival, but cooperation was vital for challenges too great for any one person. This delicate balance shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and personal responsibility today. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you reflect on the mental and emotional strength required to endure such a world, year after year. The people who lived on the American frontier were not superhuman. They suffered, struggled, and sometimes broke under relentless pressure, yet many adapted and persisted. They cultivated skills, resilience, and mindsets that allowed them to find purpose and even moments of joy amid the hardships. Night settles in again, enveloping the land in a deep, almost sacred silence, a silence untouched by the clamor of industry or progress. The day's experiences linger in your mind, offering a rare glimpse into a world that feels at once strangely familiar and hauntingly foreign. This is a world where survival demands relentless vigilance, where comfort is a fleeting luxury, and death walks beside you like an unyielding shadow rather than a distant threat. As sleep begins to pull at your eyelids, you find yourself wondering about those who chose, or were forced into, this life. What fire burned in their hearts that drove them westward? What invisible strength sustained them through blizzards that howled like spirits, droughts that cracked the earth, illnesses that stole vitality, and losses too heavy to count? And what would they think now, looking upon the world their sacrifice helped build? A world of abundance, security, and comfort far beyond their wildest dreams, constructed on the backbreaking labor and silent sacrifices of those forgotten by history. These questions trail you into dreams painted with endless prairies that ripple like golden oceans, towering mountains scraping the heavens, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not with the flash of gunfire or the dramatics of legend, but through quiet, steadfast courage. Their heroism was measured in day-to-day persistence, a refusal to surrender to the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Stripped of Hollywood's glamour and frontier myths, their story stands as a powerful testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary bravery of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. Golden light spills across the rugged landscape, casting long shadows and igniting a fierce appreciation for the raw, untamed beauty that lured so many westward. Despite the relentless dangers and ceaseless hardships, the frontier was a place of breathtaking grandeur. Vast prairies that rolled like endless seas, mountains that clawed at the sky, and canyons plunging into the earth's mysterious depths. This beauty, this fierce, wild splendor, was no Hollywood fabrication. Yet, even this relationship between humans and nature was complex, marked not by reverence but by a mentality of conquest and exploitation. The frontier mindset saw nature not as a sacred trust to preserve, but as a resource to be mastered and used. Timber was felled with little thought for regrowth. Game animals were hunted relentlessly, pushed toward extinction in many regions. Streams and rivers were diverted or fouled by mining operations, with scant concern for the life downstream. The near annihilation of the American bison, majestic buffalo that once roamed in staggering numbers, stands as a chilling emblem of this destructive approach. In the 1700s, between 30 and 60 million bison thundered across North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation was not merely the result of hunting for food or hides. It was also a calculated policy, sanctioned and encouraged by the U.S. government, aimed at devastating the Plains Indian tribes by stripping them of their primary resource and forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he uttered these exact words, they chillingly embodied the harsh reality of U.S. policy at the time. The destruction of the buffalo herds was not mere hunting. It was a deliberate act of environmental warfare aimed at erasing indigenous resistance by stripping away the very foundation of their existence. For Native American nations spread across the vast West, the relentless expansion of white settlers wasn't just an invasion of land, it was an apocalypse that shattered everything they held sacred. This was more than physical displacement. It meant the collapse of deeply intertwined economic systems, spiritual practices, and cultural identities rooted in the land and its resources. The buffalo was not only a source of food and materials, but a symbol of life itself, woven into ceremonies, stories, and the very soul of indigenous peoples. In the early days, some encounters between native groups and settlers involved cautious trade and cooperation. Yet by the 1870s, most indigenous communities faced devastating choices: accept confinement on reservations, continue a seemingly hopeless resistance, or submit to forced cultural assimilation. The reservation system, far from a refuge, functioned as a tool of cultural genocide. Native children were torn from their families and placed in boarding schools with the chilling mission to kill the Indian and save the man. As Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, coldly declared, these children were stripped of their identities, their hair cut short, their native languages forbidden, their religions outlawed, their cultures erased. The wounds inflicted by these policies run deep, casting shadows across generations and still echoing in native communities today. Armed resistance was met with overwhelming force, nearly always ending in tragic defeat, though some tribes held out longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where the combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, stands as one of the last fierce victories for indigenous peoples. But the triumph was short-lived. What followed were brutal military campaigns characterized by relentless attacks on villages, indiscriminate killings of women and children, and systematic efforts to crush native existence. The tragedy of this cultural collision is made even more heartrending by the fact that many native nations possess sophisticated agricultural techniques, complex governance, and rich traditions, knowledge that could have enriched the settlers' new society, but was instead ignored, suppressed, or destroyed. This history is not just about loss, but about resilience and survival amidst relentless attempts to erase an entire way of life. The different approaches to land use and ownership created fundamental misunderstandings. For many native groups, the very idea of owning land was as unimaginable as owning the air they breathed or the stars above. This profound difference made treaty negotiations over territory fraught and almost doomed from the start. But these cultural conflicts extended far beyond native-white relations. The West was a mosaic of humanity, home to communities from around the world, each carrying their own languages, religions, customs, and visions of frontier life. This diversity brought strength, introducing a wealth of skills and perspectives, but also seeded tension, as scarce resources and limited infrastructure forced these disparate groups into uneasy coexistence. Chinese immigrants, who were essential in building the transcontinental railroad and developing mining operations, faced relentless discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law to restrict immigration based on nationality, emerged from decades of growing anti-Chinese sentiment in Western territories. Chinese miners were often violently driven off productive claims or forced to pay unjust foreign miners' taxes. Their communities endured riots and mass expulsions whenever economic hardships hit the frontier. Mexican Americans, many granted U.S. citizenship through territorial annexation rather than immigration, similarly faced displacement and prejudice. Despite treaties promising protection of property rights after the Mexican-American War, many Mexican landowners lost their holdings through legal chicanery, intimidation, or outright fraud. Long-standing Spanish-derived water rights systems, vital for life in arid lands, were supplanted by English common law rules, ill-suited to the region's harsh realities. Even European immigrants found their national and religious identities shaping frontier life. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews often formed distinct enclaves. These communities offered support and preserved cultural heritage, but could also become targets of nativist resentment when economic or social pressures mounted. African Americans who moved west after the Civil War sought refuge from Southern oppression, yearning for freedom and new beginnings. Yet, they too encountered entrenched discrimination and barriers, facing a different but equally harsh form of exclusion in their pursuit of the American dream. Black cowboys, who made up approximately 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, were often invisible in the stories told by their contemporaries and omitted from the mythic tales that followed. Their sweat, skill, and courage on the range went unacknowledged, buried beneath the popular legends that celebrated others. Black homesteaders carved out new lives and built communities across several Western territories, yet their efforts were met with fierce opposition. White neighbors organized resistance, and homestead laws were twisted and applied unfairly to keep them from claiming their rightful land. The dream of opportunity was shadowed by discrimination and hostility. The frontier was not the simple, harmonious melting pot later American mythology would paint it to be. Instead, it was a complex mosaic of peoples, each with distinct cultures, values, and ways of life, often clashing amid deep inequalities. The romantic ideal of unity obscured the harsh realities of power imbalances, whose cultures were allowed to flourish and whose were silenced or erased. As you walk through a frontier town, you witness firsthand the whirlwind of change sweeping the West in the 1870s and 1880s. What began as scattered homesteads, independent miners, and small businesses is transforming rapidly. Corporations are moving in, reshaping the land and its people. The arrival of the railroads was the catalyst. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 shrank the vast continent, turning months of arduous travel into mere days. Branch lines spread like veins, reaching into remote corners, linking them to the nation's heartbeat, the markets, the factories, the supply chains. This new connectivity brought great wealth and rapid growth, but it also disrupted the old ways. The extraction of Western resources was now on an industrial scale, feeding Eastern factories hungry for raw materials. Mass-produced goods flooded Western stores, changing the local economies forever. For small miners, farmers, and ranchers, the future looked grim. They could not compete with giant corporations armed with capital, machinery, and political influence. Mining companies industrialized operations, pushing out independent miners. Family farms struggled under the shadow of sprawling agricultural enterprises. Small ranchers found themselves cornered by cattle companies backed by money and power. Corporate interests were no longer just economic players. They held immense sway over governments, territorial and emerging state authorities alike. Railroad companies, mining corporations, timber barons, and wealthy landowners became the unseen rulers of the West, steering its destiny to serve their ambitions. The frontier was evolving, and with it, the balance of power shifted irrevocably, forever changing the lives of those who called this vast land home. The battle for water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions was rarely a fair fight. These precious resources were often handed over through systems rigged to favor those with wealth and influence, leaving small ranchers and local communities struggling to stake their claims. The raw, untamed frontier was evolving, but this transformation was about far more than money. It was a profound cultural shift. Rough mining camps and dusty cattle towns began to take shape as permanent settlements, laying down roots that tied them to the wider fabric of society. Banks opened their doors, schools welcomed children, churches offered sanctuary, newspapers chronicled daily life, theaters entertained, and fraternal organizations built community bonds. Streets were carefully planned, sometimes paved, and wooden buildings gave way to sturdy brick and stone. Local governments emerged, passing laws to regulate behavior that had once been left to personal codes and raw survival instincts. For many who had been drawn west by the promise of freedom from Eastern authority, these changes felt like the taming of the wild, a suffocating loss of the very liberty they had sought to claim. Some answered this by pushing further westward, forever chasing the horizon to stay ahead of civilization's encroachment. Others wrestled with the new realities, adjusting to rules, competition, and social expectations that challenged the rugged independence they cherished. The official closing of the frontier, declared by the 1890 census, wasn't just a bureaucratic milestone. It represented a wrenching cultural and emotional reckoning for those whose identities were forged in the crucible of frontier life. Central to this shift was the effort to control and, to some degree, tame the violence that had long defined the frontier experience. The legendary gunfighters and outlaws who now dominate Western lore lived in a fleeting era when formal law enforcement was still taking shape. Personal justice and vigilante actions gradually gave way to professional police forces and court systems by the 1880s and 1890s in most settled towns. Yet, in the more remote corners, old-style conflicts occasionally still flared. Names like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James captured public imagination during this turbulent transition. But their lives were far from simple. They frequently straddled the line between legality and lawlessness, shifting roles as circumstances demanded. The myths built around them obscured the complex, morally ambiguous realities they embodied. Hickok, far from a flawless sharpshooter, accidentally killed innocent bystanders in at least 2 shootouts. Earp's life blended roles as lawman, gambler, brothel owner, and vigilante. Jesse James's Robin Hood image glossed over his Confederate guerrilla past and the innocent lives lost in his crimes. As evening falls on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself reflecting on the vast gulf between the gritty truth of frontier life and the romantic legends it inspired. Why did Americans, and eventually the wider world, fall in love with such an idealized version of a brutal and unforgiving era? What needs did these stories fulfill, and what inconvenient truths did they conceal? Perhaps part of the answer lies in the timing. The most intense period of frontier myth-making came just as the real frontier was slipping away. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows kicked off in the 1880s, dazzling audiences in the East with staged battles against Native Americans and dramatized stagecoach robberies. Meanwhile, railroads, telegraph lines, and government agencies were busy knitting the West tightly into the fabric of mainstream American society. These spectacles weren't history lessons. They were carefully crafted entertainment designed to fit Eastern fantasies about the West. The dime novels that circulated wild tales of Western heroes didn't emerge from the frontier itself. Instead, they were churned out in publishing houses far from the dusty trails by writers who mostly never saw the places they wrote about. These formulaic stories painted the West as a theater of simple moral battles, heroes versus villains, with the frontier as a proving ground for rugged American ideals like self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Hollywood Westerns would later take these myths, polish them, and cement iconic images in our minds. The lone cowboy standing tall, the noble sheriff upholding justice, the ruthless outlaw, and the savage Indian. These images bore little resemblance to reality. But these films and stories served a bigger purpose than mere entertainment. They offered comforting narratives about American identity, especially during times of rapid change and global uncertainty. They claimed the American spirit was forged in the harsh crucible of frontier life, granting the nation unique strengths and virtues that set it apart from the old world. This mythology framed U.S. expansion across the continent not only as inevitable, but as morally justified. It cast the conquest of land as a noble march of civilization over wilderness, progress over so-called primitive cultures. It told simple stories where good always triumphed over evil, usually through justified violence, and in doing so bolstered America's emerging military and economic dominance on the world stage. But beneath these gleaming myths lay a far more tangled and painful truth. These stories obscured the genocide of native peoples, the exploitation of immigrant laborers, the ruthless destruction of the environment, the manipulations of powerful corporations in politics, and the bitter divisions within communities over identity, governance, and resources. The true West didn't offer neat moral lessons. Instead, it unfolded as a tangled, complex story, one of human society's grappling with unforgiving environments. Sometimes it was a testament to cooperation and creativity, other times a dark tale of greed and cruelty. As darkness settles once more, you pause to reflect on your brief journey through this unromanticized Wild West. You've seen firsthand why the average person today, accustomed to an abundance of food, reliable medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts foreign to frontier life, would likely not survive even a single day amid the harsh realities of the 1870s frontier. The skills, knowledge, physical endurance, and psychological resilience demanded by frontier survival form a way of life so distant from modern experience it's almost unimaginable. Yet there's something about this stark world that continues to captivate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life stripped down to essentials where every action has immediate consequences and every small victory is a tangible triumph over nature's relentless limits. Perhaps it's the sense of community born from shared hardship, bonds that bridge divides of background and belief. Or maybe it's simply the reminder that human beings can endure and even find meaning in conditions far harsher than most will ever know. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond myth. It shaped real systems and structures that still influence modern American life today. Property laws, water rights, the balance of federal and state power, approaches to natural resource management, all grew from the compromises and conflicts of frontier times. The diversity of Western communities, despite brutal attempts at forced assimilation, helped form the multicultural fabric of America today. Even the ongoing tensions between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and national standards, exploitation and conservation, trace their roots back to frontier-era debates. For Indigenous peoples, however, the frontier era was no proud chapter of national progress. It marked devastation, the loss of ancient lifeways, and the start of a long, ongoing struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty. This is the real story of the West. Complicated, painful, and enduring. Their perspective reminds us that the simple, triumphalist story of Western settlement ignores the deep, complex civilizations that already existed and the vast knowledge that was lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple truths at once, recognizing both the courage of those who built new communities in harsh conditions and the suffering of those displaced by this expansion. As you drift towards sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, maybe the faint notes of a piano from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences, at least, connected everyone who lived through that era. No matter their background or story, the vast skies, extreme weather, rugged landscapes, and deep silences shaped all who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the land, even in the midst of cultural conflict. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again watch a Western movie or read a frontier novel without recognizing the polished, simplified version of a much more complicated truth. And you'll feel a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary comfort and safety of modern life, achieved through advances that frontier settlers could scarcely have imagined. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and knowledge lost in the transition to our specialized technology-dependent society, the practical self-sufficiency that allowed frontier people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with minimal outside support. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds, who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resources available to them. Their story, stripped of Hollywood's glitter and glamour, holds a profound tapestry of genuine courage, heartbreaking tragedy, relentless innovation, fierce conflict, unexpected cooperation, brutal cruelty, and quiet kindness, enough to fill volumes of history. Their legacy pulses through the towns and communities they carved from raw land, the environmental shifts they set in motion, the cultural rhythms they birthed, and the enduring myths born from their lived experiences. Though the real Wild West vanished long ago, transformed by the march of technology, swelling populations, economic networks, and altered landscapes into today's sprawling cities, suburbs, highways, and managed parks, its echoes linger. These traces resonate in regional identities, local customs, land use traditions, and governing frameworks. The memory of this defining era continues to shape how Americans perceive themselves and their nation's journey, while historians and communities alike strive to replace simple myths with richer, more inclusive truths about this complex past. As you finally give in to sleep, the line between past and present softens. The challenges these frontier communities faced, adapting to harsh environments, managing scarce resources, forging functioning societies from diverse peoples, balancing fierce individual freedom with communal needs, still ripple through today's world, transformed but deeply relevant. Perhaps the frontier's greatest inheritance isn't answers, but enduring questions about how humans adapt, build community, and relate to the natural world, questions each generation must wrestle with anew as circumstances shift. Above, the stars blaze brightly. The same stars that guided weary travelers across endless prairies, helped farmers time their planting, and comforted homesick immigrants far from their roots. In this timeless moment, you feel a fragile kinship with those who gazed upward, a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow might hold in a world where survival was never assured. But life, with all its harshness and beauty, was lived with a raw intensity rarely matched in our modern comforts. Sleep finally arrives, bringing dreams of a West both unforgiving and magnificent, a place where human frailty and strength stood side by side, where peoples clashed and sometimes united to shape a nation, and where the daily fight for survival was punctuated by moments of awe beneath landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, free from romantic illusion, offers us a glimpse into humanity at its most fundamental, challenging, terrifying, and at times sublime. So after hearing all these harsh realities and stories of resilience from the Wild West, what do you think? Are you satisfied with this deep dive into the true life on the frontier? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment down below to share your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to support more stories like this. And before you go, we wish you a peaceful and restful night. Good night, everyone.